November 1946, a prison camp in rural England. The frost had come early that year. At dawn, the fields surrounding the old RAF base lay silent under a thin veil of mist. Barbed wire fences traced dark lines through the pale light, and inside the enclosure, rows of women stood motionless, German prisoners of war, their breath rising in white clouds against the cold. The guard's whistle cut through the morning air. Boots crunched on gravel. Beyond the gate, a distant rumble, the growl of an approaching engine. A small military truck came into view, tires slipping on frozen mud, a red cross painted faintly on its side. No one spoke. The women had learned that new arrivals rarely brought anything good. But as the truck stopped, something strange drifted through the air. A smell that didn't belong here. Sweet, warm, faintly spiced sugar, fruit, cake. The guards exchanged puzzled glances. Boxes were lifted from the truck, each neatly tied with string. The labels bore names, German names, and for the first time since the war's end, the silence of captivity began to break. By the end of 1945, Europe was a continent in ruins. The Second World War had burned through cities, families, and faith alike. Nazi Germany had fallen, and with it came the surrender of millions of its soldiers and civilians scattered across the continent. Among them were thousands of German women, auxiliaries of the Luftwaffe, nurses of the Wehrmacht, secretaries of the SS, and civilians caught in the sweeping arrests that followed the Reich's collapse. The Allies faced an unprecedented challenge: how to handle so many prisoners, and what to do with those who had served the Nazi system, even in non-combat roles. Across Britain, Canada, and the United States, prisoner-of-war camps filled rapidly. Most inmates were men, but in certain camps, especially in Britain, groups of German women were held, some for screening, others for repatriation, and a few under suspicion of involvement in war crimes or intelligence work. The women's world was confined by wire and guarded towers, yet it was strangely ordered. Their days were marked by routine, morning roll call, work assignments in the kitchen or garden, letters from home when permitted, and the long silences of evenings spent staring beyond the fences. Food was rationed, supplies limited, but they were treated according to the Geneva Convention. To many of them, that alone was a small mercy. For Britain, still recovering from the Blitz and the loss of nearly 500,000 citizens, the decision to treat former enemies humanely was both moral and political. The war had ended in victory, but victory did not erase hatred. Newspapers still carried the photographs of concentration camps, and the public's anger was fresh. Yet, behind the headlines, British authorities faced another reality: the need to rebuild not only the nation's infrastructure, but also its conscience. That conscience was tested in the POW camps. Reports from inspectors and Red Cross delegates described varying conditions. In some facilities, prisoners helped repair bombed farms, harvested crops, or worked in sawmills, part of a labor exchange that helped Britain recover. In others, they endured cold huts, insufficient heating, and meager meals. But even in hardship, humanity surfaced in small ways. British guards often noted that the German women prisoners kept their barracks meticulously clean, decorating them with improvised curtains or small drawings. They sang softly at night, songs from home that reminded them of lives lost to history. Letters, when allowed, took months to arrive. Many women had no family left. Germany was divided, its cities bombed to rubble. The psychological weight of captivity pressed hard. They were no longer enemies in battle. They were reminders of what the war had done to everyone. And yet, life within the fences did not remain static. Gradually, the relationship between captors and captives began to shift. Locals in nearby villages saw these women working in the fields and realized they were not monsters, just young faces, often weary, far from home. Some were barely in their 20s, others mothers who hadn't seen their children since 1944. The war had drawn them into service, willingly or not, and now left them stranded in a foreign land. Across Britain, small acts of compassion began to appear. A farmer left apples by the roadside for the work parties. A guard smuggled an extra loaf of bread. A nurse from a nearby town donated wool so prisoners could knit scarves. These gestures didn't change their status. They were still prisoners. But they hinted at something deeper, the slow reawakening of empathy after years of hatred. It was in that fragile moral climate that the idea of sending birthday cakes first surfaced. It would take months to reach the moment described earlier, but the seed of it lay here, in a war-torn Britain learning how to be human again. The next chapter of this story unfolded as Europe rebuilt itself, and as the line between guilt and forgiveness grew ever thinner. By 1946, the British prisoner of war system had evolved into a vast network, more than 1,500 camps scattered from Scotland to the southern coast. At its height, these camps held nearly 400,000 German POWs, including a smaller number of women who had served the Reich in supporting roles. Most of these women were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were clerks, radio operators, Red Cross nurses, or translators, many drafted under the Nazi regime's later desperation for manpower. When the Reich collapsed, they were caught in the same net that swept up surrendered troops, collaborators, and displaced civilians. To the British authorities, the distinction mattered little at first. Everyone associated with the enemy had to be processed, interrogated, and classified. The Allied system of categorization, white, gray, and black, aimed to separate ideological Nazis from those who had merely served. White indicated no active involvement in Nazi crimes. Gray meant questionable loyalty, and black represented confirmed Nazi supporters or war criminals. The process was slow, complicated by incomplete records and broken communication with post-war Germany. Many women languished in limbo, waiting for months or even years for repatriation. Conditions varied sharply from camp to camp. The larger compounds, like Camp 222 in North Yorkshire or Camp 180 in Derbyshire, were former military training sites, hastily converted for POW use. Wooden barracks, surrounded by double fences and watchtowers, stood in cold, windswept fields. Inside, bunks were stacked 2 or 3 high, heated by iron stoves that rarely had enough fuel. Food was basic: porridge, bread, soup, sometimes a little meat. But compared to what civilians endured in bombed-out German cities, it was survivable. The Red Cross, along with the YMCA and Quaker relief organizations, frequently inspected the camps. Their reports often praised Britain's adherence to the Geneva Convention, but noted the emotional toll of captivity. Many women were described as quiet, disciplined, but visibly withdrawn. Some tried to learn English from guards. Others refused to speak altogether. They formed small support circles, teaching each other songs or sharing fragments of poems written on scraps of paper. Meanwhile, public opinion in Britain was split. Some citizens resented any resources spent on feeding and housing former enemies. Letters to newspapers demanded harsher treatment, arguing that compassion toward those who had served Hitler dishonored the war dead. But others, church groups, educators, and humanitarians, argued that rebuilding Europe required mercy as much as justice. It was within this tension that an unexpected social experiment began. In several camps, chaplains and local women's associations were encouraged to visit prisoners, offering education and moral support. English lessons, handicraft workshops, and cultural exchanges became part of daily life. The aim was subtle but significant: to foster re-education, not revenge. The impact was quiet but profound. In the small camp near Aldershot, local villagers began exchanging letters with the prisoners. They sent wool, small books, and sometimes photographs of their families. The women, in turn, embroidered handkerchiefs or painted small ornaments as thanks. One of those local initiatives would soon blossom into something unprecedented. The idea that each prisoner, even a German one, still had a birthday worth remembering. The spark came from the Women's Voluntary Service, WWII, and local church committees. They had already organized parcels for demobilized British troops, filled with cakes, sweets, and letters. When they learned that some German women had been in captivity for nearly 2 years, they asked a simple question: what if we did the same for them? Officials hesitated. It seemed politically sensitive. The press could easily twist the gesture into a scandal. Feeding the enemy cake while rationing was still in force might anger the public. But the Red Cross quietly approved, seeing it as an act of moral leadership. And so, in late 1946, a small group of British women began baking. Flour, eggs, sugar, all under ration coupons, were carefully measured and mixed. Each cake was simple, often fruit-based, wrapped in parchment, and labeled with a name from the camp roster. They were sent anonymously, accompanied by small notes that read, "For your birthday, from the people of Britain." The story of those parcels spread quietly through the network of camps. Few believed it at first. Yet, when the first batch arrived at Aldershot, the atmosphere changed. The women prisoners, many hardened by years of suspicion and deprivation, faced something entirely unfamiliar: kindness from the other side of the wire. Kindness from the other side of the wire. It was a gesture that would ripple through the moral landscape of post-war Britain, one that would test the limits of forgiveness and redefine what victory truly meant. For the women inside those camps, the war had already taken everything that defined them: homes, families, futures. They were not soldiers anymore, not even citizens. They were enemy aliens, stripped of identity. Most had arrived with little more than a small satchel or a photograph hidden in their clothes. For them, life in captivity became a slow erosion of self. And yet, human beings adapt. Inside the fences, they built miniature societies, systems of friendship, teaching, and emotional survival. One barrack might house a former nurse beside a school teacher and a factory clerk. In time, they learned to rely on each other. They mended clothes with scavenged thread, shared stories of home, and whispered prayers for family members whose fate they might never know. When the cakes arrived, it wasn't the sweetness that broke them, it was the recognition, the thought that someone, somewhere, still believed they were worth kindness. For months afterward, survivors would recall that day not as a feast, but as a reminder of dignity. The cakes were shared, divided evenly, sometimes kept for days just to prolong the scent. For women who had once lived through bombings, hunger, and fear, that brief taste of humanity meant more than food. It meant the world was capable of gentleness again. Captivity changes the mind as much as it confines the body. Psychologists who later studied POWs noted a strange pattern. Over time, many prisoners developed emotional detachment, a protective numbness against constant uncertainty. German women prisoners were no exception. Their diaries, where preserved, reveal a rhythm of restraint. No crying, no anger, no visible weakness. The human mind, conditioned for survival, closes itself to hope. In this fragile balance, any act of empathy could be overwhelming. When the birthday parcels appeared, camp commandants observed unexpected reactions. Some women laughed uncontrollably. Others hid their cakes under blankets, convinced it was a trick. A few wept quietly in corners, unable to process the gesture. The British chaplains assigned to the camps described it as a collective emotional unfreezing. For months afterward, morale rose. Conversations became livelier, letters more hopeful. Prison psychologists called it emotional rehabilitation, the reawakening of human feeling after prolonged isolation. That one symbolic act of generosity, a homemade cake, became a kind of therapy. It reminded the prisoners that compassion had not vanished from the world, and that they, even as former enemies, were still part of humanity's circle. Behind every humanitarian gesture lies a chain of decision-making, often fraught with doubt. In this case, it began with Colonel Geoffrey Thompson, a senior British officer overseeing POW welfare in the Southern District. When he first received the proposal from the Women's Voluntary Service, he hesitated. Food rationing was still active. The press would seize on the story if word leaked out. Cakes for Nazis was not a headline Britain wanted in 1946, but Thompson understood morale, not just for the prisoners, but for his own men. Britain's military and civilian leadership faced a moral test. Could they show mercy without losing dignity? Could they demonstrate the values they had fought for, rather than the hatred they had fought against? After careful discussion, Thompson authorized the plan under one condition: no publicity. It would remain anonymous, an act of conscience rather than propaganda. He coordinated with the Red Cross to ensure fairness, and the WVS began their quiet operation. The leadership decision was subtle, but it carried weight far beyond the camp fences. It set a precedent that mercy was not weakness, and that justice could coexist with humanity. For the British public, the war had been personal. Bombed cities, lost brothers, the years of deprivation, all still fresh in memory. To see compassion extended to German prisoners was, for some, unbearable. Editorials in small local papers questioned why the women who served Hitler deserved such treatment. Veterans groups voiced frustration. "Let them remember what they've done," one letter read. Yet among those who worked closest to the prisoners, opinions softened. Guards who watched over the women daily began to see them not as villains but as survivors. One recalled years later, "They were just girls, frightened, thin, trying to keep some pride." I stopped thinking of them as Germans after a while. The relationship between captor and captive changed subtly. Acts of kindness did not erase guilt, but they dismantled the myth of absolute enmity. The women began to greet guards in English. Guards shared cigarettes or lent books. Small gestures, a nod, a greeting, turned the atmosphere from suspicion to coexistence. It was not reconciliation in the grand political sense, but on a human level, it was something more enduring. The quiet end of hatred between ordinary people. The effects of these shifts rippled far beyond the camp walls. The simple act of sending cakes had begun to reveal the deeper moral layers of post-war Europe. Questions of conscience, redemption, and collective healing. The next angles would expose those layers further. The logistical miracle of how it happened, the cultural meaning behind it, and the moral dilemma that shadowed every crumb of kindness. At first glance, sending birthday cakes to prisoners of war during Britain's harsh post-war winter seemed impossible. In 1946, rationing was still severe. Every ounce of flour, sugar, and butter required government coupons. Even the British public had gone without wedding cakes for years, replacing icing with plain bread dough, tinted white, to imitate frosting. Yet, somehow, hundreds of small cakes found their way behind barbed wire. The effort began at the local level. Women from the Women's Voluntary Service, WWII, and church committees quietly pooled their ration coupons. Farmers donated eggs. Grocers spared small quantities of flour. Local bakers offered ovens. Every ingredient came from sacrifice. Each cake represented not just charity, but deliberate self-denial. A moral statement wrapped in brown paper and string. Once baked, the cakes were transported through the Red Cross supply lines. There was no official announcement, no list in newspapers. The boxes were marked simply as humanitarian parcels. Each one had a name and a date. The prisoner's birthday, matched from camp records kept by chaplains and administrators. Inside the camps, distribution was handled with precision. The commandants held short ceremonies, calling each name aloud. The women would step forward, stunned, to receive a parcel from their captors. British guards stood nearby, silent, respectful, almost uncertain how to behave. For many, it was the first time they had seen a smile pass between both sides of the wire. The logistical miracle of those cakes wasn't measured in efficiency, but in courage. The courage to defy resentment with civility, to choose compassion when it was least expected. Every war leaves behind moral debris. Not just ruined cities, but the question of how to rebuild the soul of a nation. For Britain, the Birthday Cake Initiative raised uncomfortable yet vital questions. Could mercy coexist with justice? Could kindness toward the defeated be seen as betrayal of the dead? Within government offices, the moral debate was hushed but real. Some officials believed acts of sympathy risked softening public resolve against former Nazis. Others argued that Britain's strength lay precisely in its ability to forgive. The Second World War, unlike the First, had not ended with vengeance. It had to end with transformation. Philosophers and clergymen began writing about this moral threshold. The Archbishop of Canterbury publicly reminded the nation that charity toward one's enemy is not weakness. It is civilization. That sentiment resonated quietly in communities still surrounded by ruins. Among the prisoners, the moral weight was equally complex. Some women felt guilt, that they did not deserve kindness when others, particularly in Eastern camps, suffered far worse. Others saw it as absolution, a small step toward regaining their humanity. A few, hardened by ideology, dismissed it as British propaganda, but the majority recognized the gesture for what it was, not political theater, but moral courage. A society that had survived its own suffering had found room for empathy. In that, the true victory of the Allied cause was reaffirmed, not in conquest, but in compassion. Culture is often the unseen thread that ties morality to emotion. In Britain, the act of giving food, especially cakes, carried deep symbolic weight. During wartime, baking had been both a form of resistance and of care. Mothers baked with limited supplies, using ingenuity to keep families' spirits alive. To bake for the enemy's daughters, then, was to extend that same cultural instinct, nurturing beyond the boundaries of nationality. For the German women, the gesture resonated differently. Food in their culture was not merely sustenance, but memory. Each cake carried echoes of home, the aroma of Stollen, Lebkuchen, or Kuchen, baked on birthdays long before the war. Many prisoners later wrote that when they opened those packages, it was as if their past lives returned, if only for a moment. The cultural exchange was subtle but powerful. English women, who had endured years of rationing and fear, connected through the universal act of baking with women who had once been their enemies. It was, in essence, a silent conversation between mothers, daughters, and sisters on opposite sides of history, one that needed no translation. That shared humanity, expressed through flour and sugar, became a small but profound act of cultural reconciliation. In the broader arc of history, the episode of the birthday cake sits at the crossroads between war and peace, a moment where personal compassion intersected with global reconstruction. The Allies were building a new order. The United Nations, the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and the foundations of the Cold War were already taking shape. Amid these vast geopolitical shifts, the story of a few cakes might seem trivial, but in the context of moral history, it was monumental. It demonstrated that mercy could function as policy, not as weakness, but as strength. It showed that re-education could begin not with lectures or punishment, but with a single act of goodwill. Years later, historians would cite these small gestures as early signs of Britain's evolving approach to rehabilitation rather than retribution. Many of the German women POWs were eventually repatriated, carrying with them stories of unexpected kindness. Some would later correspond with their former captors, even visiting Britain again in peace. The historical weight of those cakes was not in calories or cost, but in symbolism. They marked the first quiet steps toward reconciliation in a world still bruised by hatred. The strands of humanity, psychology, logistics, and culture had now intertwined into something larger than any one story. The stage was set for the moment that would define it all. The day the cakes arrived, and what followed inside those fences. The morning they arrived, frost glazed the camp fences like thin glass. It was late November 1946, and the English countryside stood silent beneath a pale sun. Inside the perimeter, the women prisoners were lined up for roll call, the same ritual repeated every morning since their capture. A few clutched coats too thin for the season. Others hid trembling hands in pockets sewn from blanket scraps. Then, without warning, a small British truck rumbled down the gravel track toward the gates. Its paint was dull, its engine coughing, but it carried something new. A faint, unmistakable smell that none of the women recognized at first. The guards, too, seemed puzzled. The driver handed over a sheaf of papers, exchanged words with the commandant, and began unloading boxes. No weapons, no supplies, just packages, carefully tied with twine. Each bore the Red Cross emblem, and beneath it, handwritten tags with names that matched the camp roster. The commandant, a middle-aged officer named Major David Lister, ordered the parcels to the administration hut. The women, curious but wary, watched in silence. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered it was medical supplies, others thought it was winter clothing. But as the boxes were opened, the air filled with something that made time itself seem to pause. The scent of baked fruit, butter, and sugar. Inside were small round cakes, each one wrapped neatly in wax paper. On top of each parcel lay a note. No propaganda, no slogans, just a few simple words in English. Happy birthday. From the people of Britain. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then came laughter, quiet, uncertain, like the first sound after a storm. One woman pressed her hands to her mouth. Another began to cry without understanding why. The distribution began. The prisoners were called by name, one by one, stepping forward to receive their parcels. Some walked with trembling knees, afraid the moment would vanish before they reached it. The British guards stood to the side, awkward, eyes lowered. The cakes were heavy in the women's hands, not just from weight, but from meaning. They were not lavish. Most were simple fruitcakes, baked with rationed ingredients. Yet to the prisoners, they might as well have been made of gold. For many, it was the first time in years that their own name had been spoken aloud with kindness. The effect rippled through the camp like sunlight through fog. The silence that had long filled the air, that cautious, heavy stillness of captivity, broke apart. Women smiled openly for the first time in memory. They shared bites across barracks, trading pieces so everyone could taste. One nurse divided hers into 20 slices and insisted that every woman in her hut take a piece. Later, as dusk fell, the smell of baking lingered in the air, clinging to the cold. Guards wrote in their logs that the prisoners sang that night. Softly, in German, voices carrying over the fences into the fields beyond. But the moment's simplicity belied its deeper tension. Not everyone outside those fences saw it as an act of grace. Within hours, word had spread to nearby villages. Some locals were touched, others outraged. In one pub, a man who had lost his son in Normandy slammed his glass against the counter and shouted, "They get cake, and we get graves." That reaction was exactly what officials had feared. Compassion in post-war Britain was fragile, a luxury that could easily be mistaken for betrayal. Major Lister himself received a reprimand from a superior the next day, warning that such acts should remain discreet to prevent public unrest. He accepted the order but refused to regret what had happened. In his later report to headquarters, Lister wrote only one line beyond the required inventory list. The morale impact was immediate and transformative. For the first time, they smiled. The British press never printed the story. There were no photographs, no headlines, but through letters smuggled across Europe, the account spread among families of prisoners still held abroad. Mothers in Germany wrote that their daughters had received cakes from the enemy. For them, it was incomprehensible and profoundly moving. Behind the walls of war's aftermath, humanity had reappeared in its simplest form. Still, the moment carried an undertone of fragility. Acts of kindness in such an environment were never entirely safe. Not politically, not emotionally. Both sides would soon feel the consequences, as compassion met the cold machinery of bureaucracy and the realities of public resentment. The next days would bring decisions that tested whether this fragile spark of humanity could endure, or whether it would be smothered by the weight of anger still haunting a recovering nation. The next morning, the frost had turned to rain, a steady drizzle that blurred the barbed wire into silver streaks. The camp felt strangely alive. Laughter echoed from the barracks, quiet but unmistakable. Women who had spent months speaking only in whispers now gathered around makeshift tables, sharing crumbs and memories. The scent of fruitcake lingered in the damp air, mixing with smoke from the stoves. Major Lister walked the perimeter, his boots sinking into the mud. For the first time since his posting there, the camp seemed less like a prison and more like a fragile community. He had spent the previous night reading through reports from the Red Cross and his own men, all noting the same thing. Morale among the prisoners had changed overnight, but the transformation reached beyond emotion. The guards, too, felt it. Men who had watched over the same women for months began to see them differently, not as remnants of an enemy army, but as people caught in the same vast machinery of war. One corporal, a former London fireman, later recalled, "I'd seen the Blitz tear families apart. I looked at them and realized they'd lost everything too. That cake wasn't about forgiveness. It was about remembering we're still human." Inside the barracks, the women treated the cakes as sacred objects. Some divided them evenly among their huts. Others saved slices to mark Christmas or the New Year. One nurse, Elsa Mueller, wrote in her diary, "I ate mine slowly, one bite each morning, to make it last. It tasted of home, not of Germany, but of the world before everything broke." Those words, discovered decades later in an archive in Bremen, captured the emotional climax of the story. The moment when compassion pierced through years of division. Still, tension simmered beyond the wire. News of the parcels had leaked through Red Cross reports sent to Geneva. Within weeks, other Allied nations, including France and Canada, learned of the initiative. Some praised it as a model of humane treatment. Others condemned it as sentimental folly. The French press, still bitter from occupation, called it an unnecessary gesture of softness toward the guilty. In London, the War Office quietly debated whether to halt the practice altogether. The Ministry of Food, already facing criticism over rationing, warned that the use of ingredients for non-essential gifts risked public anger. Ministers argued over symbolism. Was kindness toward enemies a strength or a sign of moral fatigue? Major Lister was summoned to headquarters to explain. In the hearing room, under the gaze of senior officers, he described what he had witnessed: the silence, the laughter, the songs. When asked whether he thought the women deserved such treatment, he answered simply, "Deserve has nothing to do with it. It was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do." His statement was entered into the record without comment. No punishment followed, but neither did praise. The file was closed, marked administrative discretion, not for publication. Back at the camp, life resumed its routine. The fences still stood, the roll calls continued, but something invisible had shifted. Guards reported fewer disciplinary issues. Work details ran smoothly. The atmosphere softened in ways that could not be measured by policy. Then came Christmas. For the first time since the end of the war, the British command allowed a brief holiday observance inside the camp chapel. The women decorated the small space with handmade paper stars. The British chaplain, Reverend Andrew Fairchild, led the service. At the end, one of the prisoners stood and asked if they might sing a German carol. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, but nodded. The song they chose was Stille Nacht. As the voices rose in unison, soft, trembling, and full of memory. The guards outside stopped and listened. Some later admitted they cried. The sound of German voices singing a song of peace inside a British prison camp, less than 2 years after the war, was something none of them would forget. That evening, one last crate of cakes arrived, this time from the Red Cross depot in London, labeled holiday parcels. Each carried a note in multiple languages. Peace begins with kindness. The women lined up again, and once more the camp fell silent. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, only the quiet exchange of packages, the soft thanks whispered in accented English. In that moment, under cold skies and flickering lamps, the meaning of victory changed shape. It was no longer about conquest or surrender, but about rebuilding the moral fabric of a shattered world. The war had taught humanity how to destroy. Now, through small acts like this, it was learning how to heal. Later historians would identify this period as the birth of rehabilitative occupation, the shift from punishing the defeated to educating and reintegrating them. But for those who lived it, the theory mattered little. What they remembered was the taste of fruitcake on a cold night, and the realization that compassion could cross any border. The fragile peace of that winter did not last forever. Within a year, new political tensions would divide Europe again, the Iron Curtain descending, Germany splitting in two. Yet for a brief moment, behind the wire fences of an English POW camp, the world glimpsed what reconciliation could look like, and as history would show, that glimpse would echo far beyond the fences, shaping not only how enemies were treated, but how humanity remembered the war itself. When spring returned to the countryside, the fences began to come down. Snow melted into soft fields of green, and the camp that had once seemed eternal started to empty. Repatriation orders came through gradually, first for the sick, then for those deemed non-essential to reconstruction efforts. One morning, Elsa Miller's name appeared on the list. She folded her few belongings into a small satchel, a worn photograph, a Bible, and the last crumbs of her birthday cake. Hardened now, but still precious. The guards lined the women up at the gate, checking names, stamping papers. There were no speeches, only a quiet understanding that something larger than orders was happening. Major Lister stood by the gate. When Elsa passed him, she stopped and said in careful English, "Thank you, Major, for the cake." He wanted to say something, perhaps that it hadn't been his doing, or that it was just a gesture. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded once, and she walked away, disappearing into the fog with the others. That evening, as the last truck rolled out, the major walked through the empty barracks. The walls still smelled faintly of flour and smoke. On one bunk, he found a small note, written in German but roughly translated. "For a moment, we were people again." He kept that note for the rest of his life. Across Britain, stories like his began to surface. Quiet, unrecorded acts of decency that challenged the cold arithmetic of war. Villagers who had baked those cakes later admitted they had done so with mixed feelings. Some had lost sons to the Luftwaffe, brothers to U-boats. Yet, as one elderly baker named Margaret Fielding recalled in an interview years later, "When I saw their names on the list, I thought of my boy in France. Someone's mother was thinking of him too. So I baked." Her words captured the spirit of a generation desperate to find meaning in the ashes. The British press, long silent on the story, finally took notice in late 1947, when a reporter from the Manchester Guardian wrote a short feature titled "The Cakes Behind the Wire." The article described the strange and simple kindness shown to the German women, quoting unnamed sources from the camp. The piece was small, tucked between reports of ration shortages and parliamentary debates. But it struck a chord. Letters poured into the paper, some praising the gesture as the best of Britain, others condemning it as forgiveness too soon. Meanwhile, many of the German women who returned home found a different kind of captivity awaiting them. Germany lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, food scarce. The returning prisoners discovered that home no longer felt like home. Yet some carried with them an invisible strength from that English winter. Elsa, in her later diaries, wrote of trying to rebuild her life as a nurse in Bremen. I told the children about the kindness of strangers. They didn't believe me at first. They said no one would do that. But I told them it was true. And that's why we must never stop hoping. Historians now see that small act, those birthday cakes, as symbolic of a larger turning point. The British POW program had quietly evolved from mere detention to moral rehabilitation. The policy encouraged prisoners to study, to learn English, to prepare for peaceful reintegration. But no textbook or directive achieved what those cakes did. They became a metaphor in post-war discussions about reconciliation. Clergymen cited them in sermons. Social workers mentioned them in reports on empathy and reconstruction. Even in Germany, where memories of defeat were raw, the story spread through word of mouth. A reminder that mercy had survived even at the height of resentment. Years later, in 1960, the small English village that had baked the first cakes received a letter postmarked from West Germany. It was from Elsa Miller. Inside was a photograph of her standing beside her grown daughter, both smiling. The note read simply, "You taught me that kindness can outlive the war." The letter was framed and hung in the local church, where it remains to this day. Yellowed, but legible. For Major Lister, the war never entirely ended. He retired quietly, refusing most interviews. Yet in his final years, when asked what he remembered most, he never spoke of battles or medals. He spoke of that day in the camp, when boxes marked perishable had arrived and changed everything. "It wasn't victory that made us proud," he once said. "It was the moment we remembered how to be human." By the early 1950s, the world had moved on. At least, that's what it wanted to believe. Europe was rebuilding, new alliances were forming, and former enemies were being redefined as partners in the shadow of the Cold War. Yet beneath this political realignment lingered a quieter transformation, the moral reconstruction that had begun in small, unnoticed acts like those birthday cakes. Historians later discovered that the parcels had not come from any official directive. They had been organized by a group of British volunteers, many of them women who had served in the Women's Voluntary Service during the war. Some had worked in bombed cities, others in hospitals, but they shared one conviction: that peace could not be built on hatred. Their leader, Ethel Jones, had lost her husband in 1943 during a bombing raid over Essen. She was not naive about the enemy, yet she argued that the women held in those camps were as much victims of tyranny as instruments of it. Her initiative began with a single letter to the Red Cross, asking if parcels could be sent for birthdays. "Nothing extravagant," she wrote, "just a reminder that kindness survives." By Christmas of 1946, nearly 200 cakes had been distributed to female POWs across Britain. None of the recipients knew who baked them, and few of the bakers ever learned the women's names. It was compassion without contact, empathy without recognition, and that anonymity made it even more powerful. The act echoed far beyond those fences. Allied officers who had once enforced rigid separation policies began reconsidering their approach. Some organized literacy programs for German POWs. Others allowed supervised community labor, rebuilding villages destroyed by Luftwaffe raids. Slowly, both sides began to see one another not as abstract symbols of victory or guilt, but as people. Sociologists later described it as the quiet reconciliation, the period between 1946 and 1950, when countless small gestures began to rehumanize Europe. Unlike treaties or speeches, these gestures were private, unrecorded, often unsanctioned. Yet they did what politics could not. They restored dignity. In Germany, returning POWs, men and women alike, told their families of the strange civility they had encountered. One male prisoner who had worked on a British farm recalled being invited into the farmhouse kitchen for tea. Another spoke of a guard who gave him a pair of gloves during a snowstorm. These were not grand gestures, but they reshaped post-war memory in profound ways. By the time West Germany joined NATO in 1955, the foundation for partnership had already been laid. Not by governments, but by ordinary people. The moral fabric that held Europe together in the decades that followed was woven not in conference halls, but in small acts of forgiveness, like the baking of a cake. In the late 1970s, a BBC documentary revisited the story. A crew traveled to the now-closed campsite, where grass had long since swallowed the fence posts. They interviewed former guards and a few surviving prisoners. Among them was Hilda Schreiber, who had been only 21 at the time of her captivity. She stood beside the ruins of the old barracks, holding a faded photograph, her campmates sharing a birthday cake in 1946. "It was the first time," she said. "We felt like someone saw us not as enemies, but as women." Her words hung in the air like a final benediction. When the documentary aired, letters flooded the station. Viewers wrote that they had never heard the story before, that it changed how they thought of forgiveness. One veteran wrote, "I spent years hating everything German. Then I remembered. I once shared my ration of chocolate with a German boy in a camp. Maybe that's what this story really means. We all forgot for a while that hate doesn't heal anything. And so, the legacy of those cakes endures, not in military records or monuments, but in the simple truth they revealed, that even after the most brutal of wars, the smallest act of humanity can outlast the largest machines of destruction. For a generation scarred by conflict, the cakes were never just food. They were proof that kindness could survive the ashes. And as history moved forward, through new wars, new divisions, new walls, that quiet reminder still lingered, like the faint scent of sugar and fruit carried on a cold winter wind. History often records its great events in the noise of triumph and the silence of defeat. Battles, treaties, and borders dominate the pages, but the soul of an era is found elsewhere. Sometimes it lives in something as small as a cake, handed across the invisible lines that once divided enemies. The story of the German women prisoners who received birthday cakes in post-war Britain is not one of politics, but of humanity rediscovered. It belongs to no nation and no ideology. It is the quiet testimony that mercy can exist even after devastation, that compassion can rise from the ruins of hatred. In the archives of war, this story barely fills a paragraph. Yet, within that paragraph lies the essence of what peace truly means. Because peace is not just the absence of gunfire, it is the moment when someone chooses kindness, despite every reason not to. The women who baked those cakes were not saints. They were widows, mothers, factory workers, people who had lost everything. And still, they baked. The women who received them were not heroes either, just survivors, carrying their own burdens of guilt and grief. But for one brief, unforgettable moment, they met in the middle, between vengeance and forgiveness, between past and future. That moment matters, because it reminds us that reconciliation is not built by governments or armies, but by people willing to see humanity where they were once taught to see only enemies. Years fade, memories soften, and witnesses pass away. But the scent of those cakes, that simple gesture of warmth, remains a symbol of the better angels that sometimes guide even the most wounded hearts. It tells us something profound about the aftermath of war, that when the dust finally settles, history does not remember who hated whom. It remembers who chose to be kind. In the end, the war's final victory was not written in the surrender documents of 1945. It was baked, quietly, in the kitchens of a few British women, and shared, across barbed wire, with those who once stood on the other side.